From WKNOW, this is Steve Chanley with One Question Too Many. Today's program is made possible by the law firm of Employer Advocates Group, serving California employers since 2002, with offices in Orange County and San Luis Obispo County, California. eaglawgroup.com. We're joined today by Greg Siskind, a founding partner of Siskind Susser P.C., who has practiced immigration law since 1990. He's also a co-founder of the AI software company VisaLaw.ai Ventures and has authored many books, including the annually published J1 Visa Guidebook. Thanks for being with us today, Greg.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you've been practicing law since you were 22?
I have. I feel like a very old man, but I'm not probably as old as people think I am.
So just to put it into perspective, I started practicing law when I was 27. So were you a child prodigy?
I don't know if I was, if that's the way to describe it. I did graduate high school a year early, which is not that unusual, but I figured out that if I took 18-hour course loads and I went to school in the summer and I had a semester that I got AP credit and all kinds of things like that, I could graduate early. So I was 19 when I finished up college.
Tell us about your current law practice at Siskind Susser.
So I started on big law at a large firm in Nashville. It was in the corporate department, but they were loaning me out to doing other kinds of matters, including environmental law. And then I got assigned some immigration matters. And honestly, when I finished law school, I was not really sure I was going to stay a lawyer. I was actually thinking that I was going to probably go back and get another degree and maybe go and get a PhD and do something in academia. But I got handed an immigration case, and I actually liked it a lot more than anything I had done before that. And so I went to the firm and I said, I'd like to do more of this, and I want to develop it. And they weren't particularly interested in having that conversation. But the other thing that was going on was I got my first computer in I think it was 1991, early 1991. It was, by the way, it was about $3,000 in actual dollars in 1991. So I don't even know what that would be today, but that's like basically paying $10,000 for a computer. But I had a modem, and I figured out that there were there was no World Wide Web yet, but there were all kinds of discussion boards, bulletin boards on various topics, and there were some on immigration law. And I started actually landing some immigration cases when I was at that firm, the big law firm. Got this idea that I could build the web was starting to come out in 1993. And I got the idea that I could have a website. I could build a website. They didn't have, you had to build it all yourself then. They didn't have consultants or firms that did that for you. But I could build an immigration law website. It was a federal practice area. Everything was filed by mail. And then in the early 90s, the places that had internet access were university campuses and tech companies. Most people at that time didn't even know what the internet was still. So that was my big escape plan especially when my firm told me that they didn't want me to they didn't want an immigration practice and that I was going to have to stay working in the corporate area. And then I decided I was going to make my exit. And so I spent most of good chunk of 1993 kind of planning out what I was going to do. And then actually in the spring of 94, I quit my job, hit the firm. I got married, built a website, and I launched the practice in June of 1994. And I thought I was going to be the first lawyer in the world with a website, and I wasn't. I was I think I was 3. But it was within a couple of weeks of 2 large firms in Washington that I went online almost at the same time. So I got a lot of good publicity about it, a lot of media. I mean, it was like Wall Street Journal and NPR and Time Magazine and all these places interviewed me. So it was a great start to a solo immigration law practice with that website. And that website's still around. It was a really sort of gave us some rocket fuel to build that practice initially. And the firm grew over the years. Now we have 60 people and some other businesses like that that you've mentioned that spun off of the law firm.
What was it about immigration that drew you in?
Well, I like the fact, well, first of all, there were a couple things I liked about it. One is it's ever changing. So if you had to really stay up on it because you knew it was going to look very different every year, depending on the makeup of Congress and who was in the presidency and what was going on in the court. So I like that part of it, that it kept it sort of fresh and interesting. I like that it was political. For me, that was I believe in immigration. I really like the, of that I could work in a practice area, that I was promoting something that I thought was good policy. I liked that we were up against the government in these cases. So unlike other areas of law where you may feel a little bad about, that your client won, but somebody else had to lose for your client to win. In my case, when we're up against the government, I don't really ever feel bad that the government lost and then my client won. So I like that about it as well. And I like that it was federal, which means that I could really have a practice that I could operate from anywhere and could have clients from anywhere.
So personally, I have to say that immigration law is interesting to me because my mother came over from France right after World War II. She was growing up in Nice during the time of the Nazi occupation. And so
Sure.
my mother came over, and then in turn, my grandparents and my aunts and uncles. So on my mother's side, all but one of my cousins was born in France. And also my stepfather, his parents came over from Italy. So immigration and the whole culture surrounding immigration and coming to a new country and references to the old country is very much just part of how I grew up.
Yeah, and I think your story is sort of the American story. And that's why another thing I like about this area, which in general, the country has been welcoming to immigrants for most of the history. And we kind of go through these periods of these anti-immigration feelings. And that's what we're going through right now is not exactly new. But for the most part, it's the secret sauce for the U.S. That we've always been the destination for new waves of immigrants. And usually every generation, it seems like in every generation, there's a group that's convinced that this group of immigrants is somehow worse than all the other ones that came before it. And then inevitably in 20 or 30 years, the next population will complain about the latest group.
So according to your website, part of your practice is to defend non-citizens applying for humanitarian protections and waivers involving their criminal histories. Can you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of your practice?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, if somebody's a hardened criminal, they're going to get removed, and so it's not usually those people that we're trying to keep in the United States, because that's just not going to succeed unless their country, for some reason, is not a safe place for them to go back to, and then they can get potentially something called withholding of removal, where they can they can stay here on very close supervision. But generally speaking, on the humanitarian stuff that we're talking about, we've worked over the years with populations that, and by the way, most of our practice is on employment and business and investment side of things, but we do those kinds of cases sometimes in large, high impact cases that we work on. But like one example, we represented the entire population in a class action of Ukrainians that came in after the war started in 2022. Congress passed legislation that they were supposed to get certain rights and benefits similar to what refugees get under U.S. law, and they weren't getting that. And the main one we were concerned about was the right to work. And we filed that case, and that's been 3 years and a dozen lawyers working on that case on there. And happily, we won the first round of that case and got everybody automatic work authorization. And then they were being charged $500 a pop for a work card that they weren't supposed to pay for. So on behalf of the whole 50,000, we sued again to get them refunds of those filing fees, which Congress said they weren't supposed to be charged. And in that case, we won in that case as well. It took longer, but the government, the USCIS, had to set up a refund program for that entire population, thanks to that lawsuit. Those are the humanitarian cases a lot of times that we're working on. Is not, sometimes individuals and then sometimes for large groups.
You've helped draft a number of immigration related pieces of legislation. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I've drafted a lot of things. Congress has actually only passed two or three immigration bills in like the last 20 years. So a lot of the stuff was from the middle or earlier part of my career that actually made it to law more because Congress was actually did a lot of lawmaking up until the period after 9/11, and then things kind of slowed down to a crawl. But one example is I wrote legislation on, we do a lot of work for hospitals and for rural communities recruiting doctors. There's physician shortages all over the country. And so there are programs set up to encourage foreign doctors to go to those communities for several years. And then they are allowed to remain in the United States and potentially pursue permanent residency in the U.S. after they've done their service essentially in these underserved areas. And a lot of the legislation that I had written that passed was for doctors, and that's probably because there tends to be bipartisan support physician immigration bills because it's seen more as a healthcare issue than an immigration issue for the communities that are receiving them. I've written bills on a lot of different immigration topics over the years, and some of them have ended up happening more via regulation than statute. But and a lot of the language that I've written has been incorporated into things that did make it into the Immigration and Nationality Act.
You touched on this earlier. The fact that immigration law is federal law, does it preempt state law?
It's supposed to, unless Congress actually delegates to the states the ability to do it. If a state passes an immigration law, it's usually going to get sued, regardless of whether it's helping immigrants or hurting immigrants. Somebody's probably going to sue on that ground that it's not something that states are allowed to do. That has been it's been changing over time where there's been more and more leeway for states to be able to do things, even when Congress doesn't necessarily bless it. And that's something, but it does say in the Constitution that it's something that is to be regulated by Congress and preempts the states from doing it. So that is the difference between immigration and a lot of other areas.
What are the substantive sources of immigration law in the United States?
Well, there's a lot of them. And actually when I'm wearing my AI hat with our company, VisaLaw.ai Ventures, our product VisaLaw.ai comprises the largest immigration library on the planet and has millions of pages of content that's in there. So I think a lot about where immigration law comes from because we're trying to get it all into this massive library. It starts at the Constitution, and then it works its way to the main statutory authority, which is the Immigration and Nationality Act. The Immigration and Nationality Act has been around. This version of the act is layered upon the 1920s. And then again, after World War II, the 1952 Act and the 1965 Act. But it's been amended over and over again so that it's just this massive piece of legislation that is it's probably 1,000 pages. That's just the statute. And then beyond that, you have the 8 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. You have the Foreign Affairs Manual, and so you have a lot of regulations that are from the Department of Labor and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services and the Department of State and Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection. And then there's a lot of Department of Justice regulations as well. So you have a lot of agencies that are involved with it. And then beyond that, you have just an endless supply of memos and guides and reports and things like that kind of govern the process. And then, in all of that, you have the courts. And so the biggest area in the federal court system that they are adjudicating is the immigration law. More cases are coming out of at least at the circuit court level. That's the case. So we have we're probably adding into our data set, at the federal court level, probably 5 to 10 cases every day that are making it into the library that are just dealing with immigration cases that got published. And then there's also all these administrative law courts, Administrative Appeals Office of USCIS, the Board of Immigration Appeals from the Department of Justice. You have the BALCA, the Board of Alien Labor Certification Appeals, and 3 or 4 others that also between them probably have over 100,000 decisions that we had to track down and get into our library. So it comes from a lot of places.
Quite a corpus of law you just ticked off there.
Yeah, it's hard to keep up. That's why AI is great for it. It really is hard to even to research it, to know where to look is hard. So that was one of the reasons I built my product.
And you mentioned manuals and memos. To what extent aren't those underground regulations as not having been promulgated appropriately under the Administrative Procedures Act?
Yeah, so that is a common way that there's an attack on what the administration is doing, and it's not unique, by the way, to the Trump administration. The pro-immigration groups sue in a anti-immigration administration, and then it's the opposite. And when it's a pro-immigration administration, where anti-immigration groups are suing, and that is a frequent, what you just mentioned is sort of a frequent basis for it, which is that they didn't go through proper rulemaking and that they needed to. So you usually, the memos should follow from the regulations or from the statute, but usually from the statute usually is not, it's unusual to have a statute that's directly on point on a particular thing. So usually it has to be regulations that fill the gaps, and then to fill the gaps between the gaps in the regulations, that's where the policy memos should be coming in. But there have been that is a frequent source of litigation, is somebody suing, saying the policy that they didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act and that they had to do actual rulemaking. And rulemaking by policy is not something that you're allowed to get away with under the Administrative Procedures Act, except in very narrow circumstances. So there's a lot of lawsuits that get filed on that basis. There's a lot of anger in the current administration about the fact that that's happened. It happened. By the way, it happened to the Biden administration too. But there's and that's I guess it was probably about a month ago. There was an executive order that was dropped on a Friday night, basically attacking the immigration bar for engaging in vexatious and some other interesting adjectives that I was surprised to hear, litigation, and that they were encouraging the Department of Justice to file seeking sanctions against immigration lawyers and filing bar complaints against immigration lawyers when they pursued these, I'm trying to think what the term that they used was, frivolous and vexatious lawsuits. So that was for the most part, I don't think any immigration lawyers have backed down a bit on that basis, and most of us would probably prefer not to have to sue if the process was being followed and people were actually getting justice.
So I have to note that frivolous and vexatious go together like peanut butter and jelly and salt and pepper.
There you go.
That you can't complete a sentence with one without the other. Now, in terms of the underground regulation aspect, that's not a new point of attack. It's been around for decades and decades. I see that and have seen that in the employment law context for a long time. So that's how I know about it.
Sure.
And you mentioned executive orders. Historically, have executive orders played a role in defining immigration law?
Yes and no. I mean, usually an executive order it's supposed to basically give some direction to the agencies that are to pursue a certain direction. And the Biden administration issued executive orders that had an impact on immigration too. So one example is the AI executive order that he issued, which got a lot of attention for trying to promote AI development in the United States. And so a lot of the media was covering it from more of sort of that broader aspect, but it had an immigration section to it. And it was talking about in there that there should be policy and regulatory changes that were designed to encourage machine learning and AI substance experts to make it easier for them to pursue immigration to the United States. And then that was followed by policy manual changes at USCIS that mostly talked about sort of like how to look at evidence and how to look at it more favorably. And I don't think and some of those would get challenged potentially as well. That will work. But then an executive order has the ability to be be revoked by a president and replaced by another one. And President Trump, on his first day in office, said, "I'm revoking that executive order and replacing it with another executive order," which that one didn't have anything about immigration. And that's kind of left this weird place for the immigration service of like, what do we do with this regulation now? Is this really something that this current administration wants us to get rid of or not? And, so we sort of like are left wondering. But the executive orders were not a big thing in immigration for most of my career until probably the last 10 years.
So in the hierarchy of substantive law, beginning with the United States Constitution, where do executive orders fall?
Well, pretty low as far as like they do have to, an executive order can't contradict a statute or something. They can, if Congress has passed something, the president can't just like basically wipe away, something that's been passed by Congress and is actual law. So usually they're operating on the edges where they have to they have to look to find things and make interpretations of existing law or existing regulations to do things. So there have been some, and the lesson on that is it's like you really will have a lot more success if you actually go through proper rulemaking. And President Obama, I think, made a mistake, for example, when he created the DACA program, which most people are familiar with, probably listened to this, and that's the program's been around for 13 years. He did that initially by executive order, and then telling the immigration service to create this program, and then they created the program by memo. And then, of course, they got sued, and it's been in litigation now for a number of years. But had they gone through rulemaking, they probably could have, had an easier time of that surviving litigation in the long run. Now we still are, it's all these years later, and Congress is going to be not Congress, Supreme Court's probably going to be ruling on it next year. But we've had a decision for several years at the district court level saying that it was illegally promulgated on there. So that is executive orders are usually, they're basically supposed to set the framework for what the administrations, the executive agencies are going to be doing. They should be, usually trying to work on regulations if they want these executive orders to have more of a lasting effect. But if they take shortcuts and just issue promulgations based on an executive order at the agency level, they could be, and we're already seeing that happen with this administration. Like we had the birthright citizenship was that pronouncement was made by an executive order, and there's specific constitutional language on that. But that one was just basically pushed out and saying this is the policy of the United States now, and that was immediately stopped by the courts. Other executive orders probably, have a better chance if they're written a little bit more narrowly to be really clearly supported by rules that are already out there or statutes that are already out there, or giving instructions of going through the proper process to make policies that are a priority for the administration and the law of the land. That has been sometimes adhered to more than others as far as the president's issuing those orders.
Or at least in the context of immigration law, in your view, they're not an executive fiat that somehow has greater weight than regulations, for example.
Yeah, and regulations are supposed to interpret what Congress set out. So at the end of the day, Congress is supposed to create the actual immigration laws. The president is just supposed to carry them out. There's some leeway in that, but it's when a president basically wants to rewrite the laws that Congress had through executive order, those are the ones that are most likely vulnerable to litigation.
Earlier, you mentioned an executive order, I believe, by President Biden having to do with AI. How heavily do you believe that the technology and industrial sectors of the United States economy rely on a steady supply of talent from other countries through the HB1, the A1B visa programs?
Yeah. So it has been for many years that there's been a heavy reliance on a lot of sectors in the United States on immigrant labor, and that is at the highest, skill levels and at the lowest skill levels. So if you look at the highest skill levels, you'll see, for example, in medicine, which, like I said, I do a lot of work for representing rural communities and doctors in hospitals. It is about a quarter of all the doctors in the United States initially came on visas to the U.S. and they trained through our residency programs. And and they're working all over the U.S. And in some fields like internal medicine, it's something like 40%. Psychiatry is almost half of all the psychiatrists in the country that are coming out in the last 20 years or so came on visas. So very heavy reliance there, but it's also there's a lot of dependence on global talent in some of the and certainly in Silicon Valley, sort of seen by who the leaders are of these companies that are Microsoft's CEO is an immigrant, Tesla CEO is an immigrant, Google CEO is an immigrant. They have a lot of the big companies. Intel was founded by a Holocaust survivor. That is that's sort of been a theme for a lot of years. It's not a new phenomenon. The attraction of the United States, its ability to get this talent has been a blessing for the country for a lot of years. So that's I think it's pretty concerning for people. But, I mentioned the low end as well, that, the chances are pretty good that when you look at your dinner plate tonight, that the food that's on your table literally is there because of immigrants who probably picked the crops that went into your food. And, I think the number is almost 70% of farm workers in the United States are immigrants on there. So it comes up in a lot of spaces. And I think that it's one of these things, you'll miss them when they're gone because we won't be able to do half the things that we do as a country. When you have only 4% unemployment, there's not exactly this ready supply of domestic labor to fill the spot. So that's kind of a dangerous thing. And that's why there's a lot of warnings right now about inflation, not just from tariffs, but also potentially, and not just immigration policies directly, like removing people, but also people choosing not to come in the first place and people that are already here choosing to leave and deciding that they would rather be in another place.
Is there currently any effort to limit the hiring of employees through the H-1B visa program?
So that was a sort of an interesting, in the period after the election and before the inauguration, there was this very public fight between Elon Musk and several people in Silicon Valley. I think Vivek Ramaswamy, who was a presidential candidate, were both on one side, and a lot of loyalists to the MAGA cause on the other side fighting about that. And Elon Musk said basically, you're going to restrict H-1Bs over my dead body. I think he actually used that language on there. And that was a change from what we had seen certainly in the first Trump administration, where there was a full-on attack on the H-1B program and a lot of litigation in the space, some rulemaking that also you could go through rulemaking, by the way, but you can still get sued and your rule could be thrown out by the courts if you can't show it's supported by the actual statute that you're purporting to be interpreting. So we haven't seen much yet on the H-1Bs, but what we have seen in the last few days and weeks is this attack on students. Most of the media is covering the ones who have been involved in political protests, but what's not being covered very well is that probably 95% of the 5,000 or so that have suddenly had their status revoked in the United States and being told to leave the country, that most of them are not political, and usually a very high percentage of them would be heading into Silicon Valley and would probably be pursuing H-1B visas. So they had left the H-1B visas alone, but basically took this indirect attack, which is essentially going after that same supply of labor.
I will point out that the issue of immigration as a political matter is nothing new. It's actually been part of United States politics for decades now. Why do you suppose that
Centuries.
is?
The Know Nothing Party from the 1800s, you probably remember from your history books. That was there were parties that they were trying to keep out the Irish. They were trying to keep out the Chinese during the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s. Eventually they turned their attention to Jews and Italians and passed the National Origins Act in 1924, which set the stage for closing the doors during the Holocaust for refugees to come into the United States. So nothing is new. I think there are some things that are new with this administration as far as the attacks on institutions, but nothing is new as far as attacks on immigration generally. And there's always this push and pull about how to get the policy right. And every new Congress, I think that it's come in over the generations, just thinks that they have the solution to the immigration system. Just in general, I'd say it seems like that if you look 100 years ago at the National Origins Act, which just had its 100th anniversary last year, and you look at the arguments for that, if you didn't know what years they were, or were kind of like muted the language a little bit to not be apparent what time it was, it would probably sound pretty familiar to his arguments as you hear today.
How much of this do you believe is just part of human DNA?
About drawing lines and keeping people, there's really is sort of the whole history of and it's not just the U.S. and it's not just the last couple hundred years, but basically migrations are nothing new. We're recording this during Passover, which is sort of like about the first great migration of a people, from one country to another country. So it sort of just tells you that it's the entire history of civilization is about the movements of populations and the pushing and pulling, either trying to keep people in like the Soviets did with its population of dissidents for years and years, wouldn't let them leave, to people pushing populations out on there, and then countries not wanting to let people in versus countries that completely open the door and encourage as much immigration as possible. We've had both in the U.S. I mean, we went through a period of time where there's basically, the first up until that 1924 Immigration Act, and except for some exceptions like for the Chinese, it was pretty much if you could afford a ship ticket, you could come to America. It was pretty much all it took was just the ability to get here. But it is, yes, there seems like there's always there's always a turn from one extreme to the other.
Now, this is very timely. There seems to be an effort in some quarters to do away with birthright citizenship, and there was just something on that today involving the Supreme Court. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So there was an amendment after the Civil War, or I guess it was 18. I think it was yeah. I mean, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were the Civil War ones. I think it might have been 1866 or 1867. But the 14th Amendment to the Constitution says that any person that's born in the United States is a U.S. citizen, and that was tested by a Supreme Court case that came in the 1890s. That's sort of the seminal case on it. But you have when the Constitution explicitly says something, usually that's the end of the story. But this administration, there have been some rumblings over the last several years from groups that said that there were groups that said, let's amend the Constitution. And then there were groups that said, well, maybe we can pass legislation to kind of work around the edges of that. But eliminating birthright citizenship by an executive order, when I was trying to describe even before sort of like where that ranks on what you're allowed to do, is, that's a chutzpah move. Basically for, by the administration to do that. And he issues this executive order that says anybody whose parents were not in the United States both parents were not in the United States legally, or, is not a U.S. citizen. Um, and then you have and then he said also children of non-immigrants, which means people that are here on work visas or student visas that are here legally, that their children are not citizens. So basically just the children of permanent residents or U.S. citizens, and only when both parents are permanent residents or U.S. citizens would qualify as citizens of the U.S. Now, that's there's a whole lot of distance between that, and the Constitution says anybody's born here is a U.S. citizen. So that got attacked within 24 hours. There were several lawsuits that were filed in different courts, and there were 4 cases. There might be more, but there are 4 that I'm aware of as far as rulings go. Suits were filed from coast to coast, all the way from Seattle, and I think there was a case in Maryland, a case in Seattle, a case in Boston, a case in New Hampshire, and all 4 judges immediately issued TROs forbidding that policy from being carried out. So pretty uniform at the district court level. And that was that's not the end of it when they get a TRO, but it's a pretty good indication of where those courts are going to be going, and then they would be going to the circuits and going to the Supreme Court. The news today, I think, that you're referring to, is the Supreme Court said that they would be allowing for an expedited arguments to be made, and I guess skipping through a lot of the appeals process to review that. Now, I actually am not, I'm fairly optimistic that the Supreme Court is going to side with the 4 judges. I don't think that there is a lot of wiggle room in the language. And if anything, if there is wiggle room in the language, that would be something that Congress would have to do something, and that you can't make those kind of changes by executive orders, particularly because of the chaos that it will cause if it was allowed to be carried out. And by the way, it's not just sort of punishing, the people who came into the country legally. There's one of the things that it created panic when that came out was, the people that are here illegally working, those Silicon Valley machine learning engineers that we were just talking about. If their children are not entitled to if their children don't get long-term status in the U.S., for example, like citizenship, they are not coming to the United States. I feel very confident. I've known these people from my whole career, and they, that their ability of their family to be settled with them is absolutely for them a deal breaker. And the chaos that I think it would cause in the U.S. economy with that group would not be a pretty sight.
We mentioned at the top of the show the fact that you're really quite a prolific author. Are you working on some books currently?
Yeah, I usually have at least one project going at a time. So the one that sort of, I guess, become career defining is this book that I write for the American Immigration Lawyers Association called the Practice and Procedures Manual. Very boring title, but it actually has a nickname that it does. Most immigration lawyers in the United States know the book by the nickname, which is the cookbook. And it is a systems manual for immigration lawyers, and it's been growing each edition. This latest edition, the last edition in 2023, was 4,000 pages. This next one will be a few hundred pages longer. But it's basically on all these different types of cases that immigration lawyers handle, everything that they need to handle the case. Each chapter starts with and each chapter is about 200 pages, but each chapter will start with a 20, 30 page overview of the law or citations in that particular area. And then it will be the checklist and the questionnaire forms and the process steps and the templates and the annotated immigration forms that basically sort of like it's a training manual for lawyers. But I wrote it as a software play because what I wanted was to create some standardization in how lawyers work on immigration cases and have case management systems that would be designed around the systems in this book. And that's what's been happening since the book came out in 2019. And now it's also great for input for AI as far as its ability to generate documents and generate case flows for lawyers. So that project is the 2025 edition is coming out in June. But we have to, so we're sort of in a frenetic pace for the last several weeks to wrap it up and get the latest in there for that edition, which the immigration lawyers had their big annual meeting. I think 4,000 lawyers are going to attend this annual meeting in Denver, and the book it's important to our association to have the book ready for that meeting when they're all in one place. So they usually time it so that it'll be ready for that. I'm also starting work on another book that I am hopeful that it'll be published by the American Bar Association. I think it will. On there, we're sort of having a finality of that. It's not for sure yet, but it's likely. And that book will be about a practical book on AI for lawyers, not for immigration lawyers, but for lawyers generally, ways that they can incorporate AI into their practice. Less about sort of like, this is what AI is, and this is, it's not going to be a dry book sort of trying to explain AI as much about a book, that's sort of like, these are ways that you can get AI into your practice in the near term. Here's how to evaluate products that are in the space. Here's how to mitigate weaknesses in some of the products. Here's how to comply with the ethics rules if you are using the products. But that book I want to hopefully have wrapped up by the end of summer, and then we'll probably be out in the fall, hopefully.
How many law firms do you believe are currently using agentic models to create their own custom GPTs for their firms?
Probably not that many that they're building their own products, except for mostly the very, big law is doing that to some extent. It's expensive first. Second, you have to have the technical capabilities in-house probably to do that. And the agentic part is probably also, that's really bleeding edge for a lot of firms to be doing that part of it. But yeah, there are firms that are doing those things right now. I think a lot more firms are right now, there's been an explosion of companies in the legal AI space that have, a lot of them are little niche companies like ours that are focused, ours is just focused on immigration law. And then some of them are much broader, like CoCounsel, which ended up being acquired by Thomson Reuters, was a broad legal research product on there. But there's a lot of functions that are happening, and so I think for a lot of firms, it's like, why bother trying to do this in-house when there's all these great products and these companies that are out building this stuff, and we should just sort of look for the people that are building the stuff we want and build out our capabilities around stuff that's out there.
Do you foresee a time in which the traditional role of an associate attorney will be performed by a non-attorney prompt engineer?
I don't actually see the lawyers disappearing. I think an associates disappearing. I think our roles are going to be evolving. I think a lot of what lawyers will be, I think AI will be able to do a lot of the tasks that associates and paralegals do now pretty competently, but lawyers will be, I think, a lot more involved in strategy. Lawyers will be a lot more involved in sort of the things that require the human touch, particularly, one of the big complaints that clients have about lawyers is the lawyers don't return their phone calls, or lawyers aren't communicating with them. They don't have and lawyers most of the time that are in that situation, it's like, I don't have that's not a luxury I have to be able to do that. I'm completely overwhelmed with the amount that I have to do. And I would love to be able to spend a lot more time with my clients on there. That's an example of something I think that when lawyers are freed up time-wise with a lot of the things that AI will help them with, that will hopefully mean that they will be able to work on the parts of the job that they enjoy the most. I've kind of joked that lawyers who have bad personalities are probably in the most trouble, because at the end of the day, that's probably what is going to be, driving your livelihood, is that clients want to deal with you in particular, and if they otherwise they would rather work with an AI. I think when we start seeing agentic models that are able to do a lot more of like moving from software to software and being able to perform a lot of functions that are sort of not now and can perform more broadly. Then we'll see even further changes. But I do think a lot of times lawyers are going in this initial stage. There's a lot of things that the AI is not going to do. The AI is not going to go to court and argue for you. The AI is not going to be, doing the initial consultation for you in a meaningful way, as far as like actually having laying out a strategy with the client and deciding what you're going to do. But they could do a lot of the simpler stuff in that regard. But I do think later on we're going to see probably more change happening, where you're going to see maybe judges will. There are a lot of you were already hearing about AI mediation, where two AIs might actually end up mediating themselves solutions of things without a mediator in the middle, or without and eventually you might see that happen without a judge, but an AI in the middle, and the AI for the one side and the AI for the other, all kind of hashing it out. So there may be in some aspects, but I do think probably it'll be a long time before super sensitive things like criminal law are where you see that in a big way. But I can tell you in the immigration bar right now, we're very worried about AI creeping its way into decision-making by government agencies, which is not that different. And that's already happening in other countries where, the AI will do an initial screening and approve somebody, and then they will flag cases that go for human review after that, which you would say, okay, well, that's fine. That's a person gets human review. But then the natural tendency of humans is there must be something wrong with this case, because why did the AI send it to me? And so they're already noticing that denial rates are going up in cases in Canada, for example, is one country where there had been some study of this once the AI starts to play that kind of role. So there's going to be a lot of decisions that are going to have to be made about what should be done by a human and what should be done by a judge, and what should be done by a human and what should be done by a lawyer or paralegal on there. And I don't think we're close to, at this point, having an idea of where we're going to be on.
You see AI having the potential of breaking down the barriers to access to justice by those who can't otherwise afford competent counsel, but have access to generative AI?
I mean, I think if either the people have access to the products directly, or lawyers and have access to the products, which allow them to dramatically lower their prices and be able to take on a lot more work. And I'll give you a sort of a real world example in immigration law, since that's what I know. Right now, there is a major crisis in the asylum system, where a very small percentage of people that are filing for political asylum actually can afford to hire a lawyer to work on it. And so that's fallen mostly to nonprofit organizations and pro bono lawyers. And the nonprofits and the pro bono lawyers do not have the capability of handling most of the cases. So most people are either not filing the cases, or they are filing it on a DIY approach. And that is, and that can have potentially life-threatening consequences if an asylum case is not ultimately successful. And that's one that and I was just at a meeting of actually people that work for different software companies and people that work for different bar organizations on building tools, AI tools that can help really take the amount of hours that it takes to prepare one of those cases for a law firm down to as low a number as possible, so that they can either take those cases on a pro bono basis, or being able to offer them at a fraction of the price, so that people can actually afford counsel. And that would be, tools to assist in legal research, tools to assist in drafting the asylum brief, tools to assist in with translations, which is a big problem. A very expensive process that lawyers have to deal with and that's a cost that either gets passed on to clients, and if they can't afford it, it's pro bono. It's borne by the law firm. So AI is doing a really stellar job in terms of making the translation costs that go into these cases all. So that's these tools are out there, and the people that need those tools, that are in the bar have them available. My hope is that we'll start to see a rapid increase in the number of people who are using lawyers, as opposed to right now are going the DIY or not filing approach, which is kind of counterintuitive that where people think lawyers are just going to go away and they're going to be replaced by AI. But this is an example where lawyers, there would probably be a lot more lawyers servicing that population if they had AI.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question. Have you ever asked that one question too many?
Yeah, you do that in immigration law, your own peril on there, where on there, although you don't want it to born fraud or anything like that. There have been cases where it's like, as soon as you've heard something, it's like, well, I can't represent you now on there. Now that I know this, actually, I'll give you an example of where it's come up frequently with the doctors. So we have this situation in immigration law where there's an immigration process that needs to happen. The employer has to be the sponsor, and the doctor is the beneficiary of that. And in an ideal world, the doctor and the hospital each have their own lawyer representing their own interests in terms of that part of the process. But it's not something that happens except in very rare instances. But I do have to give the warning to the doctors in the hospitals. It's like, do not call me with these. If you're going to be picking up the phone and calling me Dr. So-and-so and telling me, I hate my employer, I hate my situation, and my friend is telling me to come to this place and I'll have a much better situation and I'm planning on moving out there. It's like, if you tell me that, I either have to withdraw from representing both you and the hospital, or I have to tell the hospital what you told me, because I have an ethical obligation to them as well. Or a hospital tells me, Dr. So-and-so is really not seeing as many patients as they want, and it's already a marginally profitable clinic, and we're just gonna fire him and close the clinic down, and we're not, it's just not working for us financially on there. And it's like, then I have to tell the doctor that's coming, even though the employer probably doesn't want me to tell the doctor. So I have to have these conversations. Like, these are off limits to talk to me about, as long as I'm representing both of you.
Greg, it's been wonderful having you. Can you let our listeners know how to reach you or get in contact with you?
Yeah, you can find me at VisaLaw.com. VisaLaw.com, by the way, that's the domain name that I've had for 32 years now. I think that's one of the longest standing domain names in the legal profession. But if you go to VisaLaw.com, you'll find all my contact information. A lot of people find me on LinkedIn just by typing Greg Siskind into the search bar, and I will be the one that shows up.
Thank you again, Greg.
Thank you.